I was defending it the last 2 seasons. I thought 6 was really good. And
7 was bad.
7 was terrible in hindsight. I was really defending it the whole way through 7 when people were complaining about this exact issue, which is that it was getting away from the books. The fans of the books were like, "Oh, this isn't what we thought was going to happen. This is what we signed up for." I was like, just wait until basically this episode. That episode last week. I was like, wait until this happens, because I was the one who was like holding out on the White Walkers. I thought the Night King had a whole fucking backstory.
I know.
Everything that I thought was going to happen didn't, and it was like really, really
dog shit. It just goes to show you, we don't give a fuck about these battles. You're wasting your money on these battles. I just care about the game.
Perhaps the most passionate mode of critique possible is the criticism presented by someone who sincerely believes that they could influence the outcome of future decisions made by the writers and producers on the show. And in the past, this delusion has not been completely baseless. David Benioff and his team, the so-called showrunners, producers, directors, they have repeatedly made last-minute decisions that very fundamentally altered the plot of episodes of the TV show after the script was written, after the film was on the editor's floor. They've gone back and very suddenly, with very little thought, changed things. Now, that's happened at every stage of the show. In some cases, you have actors kind of admitting, like, whoa, what we finally saw in that episode was not what was in the script. In other cases, you have actors kind of admitting, oh, well, we got version 1 of a script, and then at the last minute, we were handed this other script, and everything had changed. So it's not ridiculous for some critics, even here on YouTube, to have the delusion that they're going to influence the creative process at Game of Thrones. I lack this delusion. So I'm instead presenting this video from the perspective of someone, who might be able to influence the audience in terms of what you do in your own lives as creative writers, as creative people. Maybe you write fiction, maybe you write nonfiction, maybe you make YouTube videos talking about politics like myself. What can we learn from the bad writing in this latest episode of Game of Thrones? Well, theater, I'd say, in accordance with Aristotle's approach to writing, but whatever. Theater is really about demonstrating things to the audience. Yes, you can demonstrate through words, deeds, actions, even how a shot is framed, what you show, what you don't show on camera, what you highlight, what you linger on. And the first half of this episode, what it wanted to demonstrate was the simple but profound realization Daenerys has that Jon Snow is perceived by his people as a great leader. Put another way, she realizes that people are eager to obey Jon Snow's authority, and they are not eager to obey her authority. That although she may be able to command obedience from people grudgingly, when they fear her, or when she offers them some kind of reward, or when her actions have a clear rationale, or when people are terrified they're all going to be killed by an enemy army, that kind of obedience is very fundamentally different from the obedience Jon Snow elicits from people. And this either could be shown to us in terms of an examination of what makes Jon Snow extraordinary, or an examination of his followership. So the point being, you could talk about it in terms of a study of leadership or a study of followership. And she has this big realization, and that changes her direction in the first half of the episode. And this episode completely failed to demonstrate that. Just very poorly written script, very poorly directed, very poor filmmaking, poor at every stage of conception and execution. So this is the one big point. Now just pause for a moment. Imagine the creative challenge of writing about the career of Mao Zedong, the dictator of China. You could have several different points in the career of Mao Zedong where people have a similar realization. Let's say it's around 1966, the start of the era of the Cultural Revolution. A lot of people have already lost faith in Mao Zedong, especially people who are old enough to remember what life was like before 1949. A lot of people just think Mao Zedong's been discredited and his political career is over in this period in 1966. And then they stop and realize like Daenerys Targaryen here, looking at Jon Snow, they realize, whoa, this guy has a type of followership among the young people, among teenagers, among young people who can't remember 1949, who can't, they might not really remember 1959. Their knowledge of politics is really shallow and really based on propaganda. And these young people, they're willing to commit atrocities at the snap of a finger in response to what this guy says. This guy has a kind of power over this followership that could be used for good and evil. And it's something we didn't recognize because we, the older generation, the bureaucratic class, were consumed with other political struggles and objectives in the last 10 years, including recovering from the Great Leap Forward. That would be a really interesting story to tell. How are you going to show that on screen? How are you going to show that? Well, you would not approach it the way these filmmakers approached this scene with Daenerys Targaryen. They've made so many mistakes here. They've really thrown away the type of world building that they built up in the first 3 or 4 seasons. This scene is a bunch of drunks looking like hobos sitting around in a bar, and some of them fall in love with each other and go away and sleep with each other, and some of them make jokes with each other. This scene is more like an episode of Friends from the 1990s, the first half here, set in this bar. It utterly lacks the sense of hierarchy and inequality in a feudal society that I feel was carefully elicited, carefully presented and achieved back when we were looking at the court of King Joffrey, seasons 1 through 3. Even when you had scenes, smaller number of people in the room, the council sitting around with the hand of the king, back when Ned Stark was alive or what have you, back when Tyrion was ruling in King's Landing. The sense of there being complex competing interests who really want to decide who is going to be the new Lord of Storm's End, who is going to be the new Lord of House Umber, who is going to own what land, who is going to receive what honors and what dignity at the end of that battle, who is going to arrange which marriage. And, the political complexity and dynamism, it is partly just demonstrated through voices from the crowd interrupting, laughing, guffawing, showing their skepticism. And if you go back and rewatch this scene, but if you watch the first half of this episode, the directors have presented this, all the background actors. There were a lot of people in the room. And these people in the background, they're standing in silence as if they're professional modern dancers at a dance rehearsal. You'd be amazed if you haven't been in the theater. When you have people who are professionals in dance, they know how to stand in silence, and they stand without fidgeting. And that's what all the peasants are doing. Not just peasants, knights, warriors. That's what they're all doing in this scene. And that's why the whole scene has this weird, unrealistic sense of being a bunch of actors on a soundstage staring into each other's eyes. And I do not think that's the world that was constructed, the world we felt and we appreciatively related to back with Joffrey Baratheon in season 1. So look, if you wanted to write a story of people recognizing, as Daenerys is here supposed to recognize, whoa, Jon Snow has power for good and ill, either because of something extraordinary about him, or about the way he's regarded, or something about the culture of how these people relate to him. Whoa, and he could use that power for good or evil, and she can't control it, and it could destroy her personally. It could end her political career. Wow, that's a really interesting storyline to achieve. That's something interesting to demonstrate. They utterly failed to do it. What if you were trying to show this in China with Mao Zedong in 1966? Would you show it by having a bunch of drunks hanging out in a bar and relating to each other so informally? No fear and no hope for promotion or something, no jockeying, no lobbying for feudal privileges. When you have Sandor Clegane sitting down with Sansa Stark and relating to her in such an informal way, speaking to her, so indecently, so grotesquely. This is much worse than an episode of a TV show like Friends. It's really bad writing. I don't think you could achieve the sense of dread and the political significance by having Mao Zedong sitting around in a bar with a bunch of drunks and having military veterans come up to Mao Zedong the way a bunch of warriors come up to Jon Snow and just pat him on the back. We have this really badly written dialogue where they just pat him on the back and they say to him, "Oh, wow, we saw you on that dragon. We saw you fighting in the battle." Like, is this how you're going to demonstrate it? So, as a writer, as a creative person, I think that's a little bit worth reflecting on, because that was the really interesting theme. As writers or actors, you're supposed to look at tactics. How are you going to demonstrate that? How are you going to show this to the audience? Now, the second half of this episode is much better written than the first half. I think it's better written than anything we've seen in 2019 from this TV show. However, that only makes it as well written as mediocre television, unlike terrible television. And the second half of this episode, I think, remains impaired or hobbled or weakened by the lack of a sense of a structured, complex feudal society. This is no longer like the court of Joffrey Baratheon. And in the books, when Joffrey dies, even though his mother is supposed to be in mourning, everyone's approaching his mother and saying, "Hey, I hear there's an empty seat available on the council. Oh, hey, we have to arrange who is going to be the new head of the Navy, the master of ships. Who's going to be the new head of the economy, the master of currency? Who's going to take what seat? Oh, well, we heard this castle is now vacant. The ruling family's been wiped out, or they were on the wrong side of the war and need to be replaced. Oh, who's going to arrange to move the border between these two counties to change which feudal manor controls what land?" All that's going on. All of that is brought to Cersei Lannister right after the funeral or what have you, and right after her new son, her much younger son, gets remarried and so on, and becomes the new king. This sense of hierarchy and protocol, and of course politesse and politeness and fear, and hope for a better world, hope for a better future. You have to have that to enrich and provide context for the type of drama that then unfolds in the second half of this episode, which is lacking. So, all political ideas have to be expressed through contrast. And, very briefly, my interest in the TV show, or my interest in the books, is ultimately about political questions that the author, George R.R. Martin, raises. And the books do set out many important contrasts between slavery and serfdom, economic freedom and feudalism, and various types of democracy. Democracy as a theme comes up in the book, and it is not presented in an idealized way. It's presented along with a sense of its corruption and, democracy existing in the same city along with slavery and other real social problems. And the type of internecine instability that democracy brings to a city. That's all set out for you in the books. Daenerys Targaryen making an argument that she represents something fundamentally different from and fundamentally better than Cersei Lannister here in the TV show, it's laughable. I actually laughed out loud. I paused the video I was watching with my girlfriend. I didn't want to ruin it for her. But I was laughing. I was like, this is ridiculous. The words they're having coming out of Daenerys' mouth, what does she think she represents? She doesn't represent helping the poor. She doesn't here in Westeros, she doesn't represent ending slavery. She doesn't represent any ideal, I should say, clearly, of making the world a better place. The only ideal Daenerys represents in the TV show, as it has been bungled and presented or misrepresented, is the idea that somebody from her bloodline ought to rule simply because they are the descendants of the people who ruled in the past, whereas anyone else with any other bloodline is a usurper, is illegitimate. Now again, if you went all the way with that idea, as crazy as it is, in medieval times, a lot of people believed it, not all. If you read historical primary source documents, you can see it was quite common for people to not believe in that concept. But, the idea of the divine right of kings passing through the firstborn, it becomes real hard to believe, especially when the firstborn son is obviously physically or mentally retarded, which happened in many royal families, has obvious health problems or is mentally impaired, and He might have a cousin. We might have someone else in the royal family who's proven to be a brilliant military commander, and wouldn't it be better to have him as the king, or whatever? This happened. History of England, Spain, France, Germany, everywhere, whatever. You can look at any of these societies that had this ideal of primogeniture, of the eldest born son, and then there were practical circumstances called into question. You could have committed to presenting Daenerys as someone who really sincerely believes that blood right alone, that her bloodline, that the principle of heredity is the reason why she should be the queen and not Cersei Lannister. Where she's, in a sense, a fanatical true believer in this. And therefore, for her, even if for nobody else, even if not for Varys or anyone else in the plot, that for her it's a crushing realization that Jon Snow has the better bloodline. But that has not been set up. That's not what we were presented with. What we were presented with back in seasons 1 through 4 was the idea that Daenerys was kind and loving and freed the slaves and cared about the poor and cared about making society a better place. And therefore, because of her soft-hearted character, or at least her liking for the slaves and the lower classes, therefore she was a better ruler. And then that has been bungled and forgotten now for 5 years or more. We haven't seen anything like that from Daenerys. If anything, the voice of the poor in King's Landing has been represented as a group of religious fanatics. And before that, you had Joffrey's widow, I'm forgetting her name now, who remarries Joffrey's younger brother, and she kind of represented a little bit more of a pro-poor approach to aristocratic politics. You could have questions here of feudalism as such, royalty as such, in contrast to either a democratic ideal or a populist ideal. Who is best fit to rule? But what we've been presented with in this episode is a series of bungled introspections on political power. We could have had something really meaningful at several junctures here, ending with the meditation, which is actually put in the mouth of Bronn the professional assassin, Bronn the mercenary. Bronn states the philosophical and political thesis of this episode. Bronn simply states that every political order is created by some kind of murderous madman, in this case a mad woman, someone so violent, so brutal, and so extreme that they create a new order, create a new feudal household, or create a new dynasty. So that's politically, that's the soul of this episode. That's where it comes from. That's where it concludes. And we're only left to take sides and cheer for either Daenerys Targaryen or Cersei Lannister on the basis of who would be more brutal, who would be more effective, or who would be more efficient in creating a social order, a type of hierarchy that we all know is vicious and evil and counterproductive and wrong. What is the point of George R.R. Martin's literary masterpiece, even if it's a flawed masterpiece? I have earlier videos talking about, shortcomings in the books. There are. It's deeply flawed. It's a flawed masterpiece. It is not conceivable that George R.R. Martin's point is that Daenerys Targaryen should be the leader of the Western world because of who her parents were. It's just laughable. And it's not conceivable that his thesis is that Jon Snow should be the leader of the Western world because of who his parents are. There were a lot of interesting questions in the books about vows and honor and obedience and social order and democracy and participation and the ability to complain and shape what happens in your society. There are interesting questions about feminism and so on too, and the role of women in society. But the conclusion this TV show has come to, even if it is just through the creative exhaustion of the team producing it, is something that is in a subtle way utterly incompatible with both the spirit and the text of the books it proceeded from. Let me ask you guys this in closing. Why isn't Kevin Lannister in this TV show? If you were to ask me what character do I most relate to, or what's the emblem of why I appreciate the books and the way I do, I would say Kevin Lannister. In the books, Kevin Lannister is someone who had to live his whole life as a background character in silence. He's someone who had to live as a combination of warrior, scholar, and bureaucrat in the feudal system. And after so many years, he finally has the chance to make the world a better place. Partly through influencing Cersei, and then after Cersei's walk of shame in the books, he basically replaces Cersei. Briefly, he's in command. So this guy's lived his life in the background, living on that edge of, honor, duty, and death. I mean, at one point in the negotiations with Cersei, he says to her simply, look, I know you're going to try to kill me. And he said, I have one castle. I think he says I have 200 knights, and they're loyal to me. I feed them well. If you come to kill me, you'll win eventually. But I'll hold out a long time against your army. We'll really fight to the bitter end. To me, that's a very moving scene. Kevin Lannister is not a fantasy character. I think many people would say he is a dull bureaucrat, in as much as the aristocratic feudal world had dull bureaucrats. His life has been devoted to breeding horses and, putting grain into silos on behalf of the peasants and engaging in the economic, political, and military life of this society. And he has almost never had a chance to speak up or do anything decisive to make the world a better place. But then he gets his chance. He steps forward in bizarre political circumstances. He's thrust into a position of power when Cersei Lannister falls from power. And he takes that chance to make the world a better place. And he is killed. He is assassinated immediately. Not despite the fact that he wants to make the world a better place, but because of that fact. To me, the storyline of Kevin Lannister is a great example of the meaningfulness of these books, of why they are great art, great literature, and contain political reflections that are worth reflecting on, that are worth teaching in university classrooms. And the total omission of Kevin Lannister from the TV show, and the failure to conjure up that sense of a complex feudal society with contrasting priorities, pressure from some people who just want land, pressure from some people who just want a better marriage for their son or their daughter, but also pressure from people like Kevin Lannister who really do want to make the world a better place. Pressure from people who have gone to study in Essos and have been to these cities where they have elections, who have been to cities that abolished slavery, like Bravos, and who have been to the cities that are still built on slavery, and who know the difference that makes. The meditations on what kind of society they ought to have, and who ultimately is willing to pay the price in blood. People like Kevin Lannister who lose their lives trying to step forward. That, to me, is a story worth telling. And it's a goddamn shame that in the adaptation from book to show, all of that has been lost, including and emblematized by the storyline of Kevin Lannister.